Chris Ballard has spoken at the NFL Combine. So, what can be taken from the tenured GM's words ahead of a massive offseason where his job might be on the line? What did Ballard have to say about internal free agents and crucial names to the success of the roster, to the success of the franchise? And what can we take away from his comments on Anthony Richardson? Well, guess what? Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Horseshoe Huddle Podcast presented by Indianapolis Colts on SI.com. I am Drake Wally, deputy editor for the site and co-host of this podcast. And then, of course, I am joined by none other than analyst for the site and other host of this podcast, Noah Gebert. Noah, Chris Ballard is such an interesting, he's just so, honestly, he's pretty wonderful to interview at these things because he's honest, he's forthright, he's going to tell you pretty much what you want to hear. And what a lot of people at this point want to hear are answers as to why this team has been so mediocre. But, what did you, first off, how are you doing, man? We're in the midst of Combine Week.
Yeah, I'm good. It's Combine Week. The Horseshoe Huddle fams going to get together tomorrow night. It's cool to see all the boys again. I haven't seen, I guess, most of you since before training camp or in the midst of training camp last year. So it's going to be good to get together. Good to have everybody down in Indianapolis. No, it's an exciting week, and getting to talk with Chris Ballard and maybe get a little bit of inside information on what's going to be happening in the coming months when it comes to free agency, resigning their own guys before free agency even hits, and then even heading into the draft, kind of getting a feed on what he's thinking. And you can always pull some nuggets on what he says because, like you mentioned, he's a good interview, right? And he's honest, and he's going to leave some hints about some things. I like leading into this. We were already kind of discounting what we thought Shane Steichen was going to say, and we're not going to really pull much from that. Not that he has nothing interesting to say. I just think he's choosing not to share that on purpose. So you could pretty much expect to not take any nuggets of wisdom out of his press conferences. So we were kind of coming into this episode assuming we weren't going to talk about anything that he had to say. He did the local interview, he did the national interview on the stage, and we still came away with the same conclusion that we'll let that be what it is. Colts fans, if you're really have a hankering for more Colts content, you can go ahead and watch those 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever that Shane Steichen did. Just if you want to hear somebody with the Colts talk about the Colts, that's what it's going to be, but you're not going to get much more than that.
Yeah, at the end of the day, man, we're going to take multiple clips from Chris Ballard's press conferences, and we're going to talk more about it because, like you mentioned, this is no offense to Shane Steichen. Shane Steichen is, if coach speak was manifested into a human being, that's Shane Steichen. He's going to give you nothing. He's going to say nothing. He's going to just talk straight to you, real fired up, progress. Anthony's doing all the right things, just really, really boring stuff. And we respect the hell out of Shane Steichen, but he's not a good interview. So we are going to hone in on Chris Ballard because really this is year 9 of a tenure of a GM that hasn't really done much. He's been to the playoffs only a couple times, and this season is absolutely critical. So before we even get started, what was your overall opinion, I guess, or what was your gut reaction from Chris Ballard's press conference? Because he did a couple different ones. He did one up on the podium in front of the national media and the local media. But then, as always, the local media, by the way, guys like Nate Atkins from Indy Star, Joel A. Erickson from Indy Star, James Boyd, Jake Arthur, our own Jake Arthur from Indianapolis Colts on SI, just absolutely give the best questions and get the best information possible. So what was your gut reaction? And while you're answering that, I have something to get real quick because he wasn't in the episode on Monday, and I'm going to go get it real quick. Go ahead, Noah.
Gotcha. Yeah, so gut reaction, I've seen a lot online of people calling it a disaster. I wouldn't go so far. I'm honestly not sure what people really expected him to come out and say. He wasn't going to come out and win over the fan base with words of how he was going to turn this season around and do things differently this offseason. I think for the most part, he didn't have a ton of answers, which I think is all right. I think in past interviews at this point in the offseason, maybe we have gotten some answers on pending free agents that some of the players were, like Gardner Minshew. We got an answer on him last year that he wasn't coming back. But all the answers that we got about impending free agents coming up before the start of free agency, he was kind of dodging around it, not giving a surefire answer, saying that, well, we'll meet up with some of these guys, but at the same time, just based on the tone of how he was answering some of those questions, you can read into that a little bit, maybe what his feelings are on some of those guys. And that's definitely a couple of the clips that we're going to hit tonight. Overall, I thought that the national press conference that he had, that was kind of open to everybody, was that 15-minute long press conference. Honestly, I thought it was more varied questions that we got. I know it was local guys in that press conference also asking that stuff, so I'm not attributing that to the national media. And then that kind of sidebar he had with the local media that we'll do a couple clips on also was mainly focused on Anthony Richardson. So if you want to hear a lot about what he's thinking about in terms of his progress in the offseason and his more views on adding competition to that QB room, then he goes into depth there. And we'll touch on kind of a little bit of that, but mostly what he spoke about in that main press conference.
Yeah, there's just so many things to take away from it. But real quick, so NFL nerd, you were not in the last episode, and I finally got my adhesive hooks. I am going to be putting up some stuff, but look at this. Look at this, buddy, right here. There it is. I finally have it right here on the podcast. Still have it. Still proud. When I first got it, a little bit unsure, but you know what? After 2024, I think Alec Pierce is going to be in a Colts uniform for quite a while. So I really appreciate you consistently hounding me on that. But hey, you know what? Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So of course, Chris Ballard spoke at the NFL Combine. This is really his time to shine. This is what he really likes to do. He likes to evaluate all these guys. So the first one, and it was actually Jake Arthur that asked about it, is, lots of internal free agents, but Ryan Kelly he's been with the team for 9 seasons. All right. And this is a guy who has just seen nothing but QB change. He's done nothing but go out there and perform. He had from 2019 to 2021, 3 straight Pro Bowls, just looked fantastic. He has been at times the best center in football. And I do think that there's still football left in Ryan Kelly. But real quick, before we dive into this, what are your thoughts on Ryan Kelly? He's coming off of more injuries. They're starting to pile up. He's 31, starting to kind of look more like a guy that you would be okay with letting go of, as difficult as it might sound.
Yeah, definitely a guy who's had a great career with the Colts up to this point. And I think if he does end up moving on and the Colts don't end up re-signing him, that's going to be with great reluctance from the Colts side. Moving on from a guy like that who's just a homegrown guy drafted with the team, been here for so long, had to put up with so many different quarterback changes, coaching changes, offensive coordinator changes. He's gone through the best of times and the worst of times with this franchise and in the time that he's been here. So it's always tough to move on from a guy like that who's always been the consummate professional and kind of a team ambassador and embrace the community. And he's just everything that you want one of your offensive linemen to be, a cornerstone of the team, that center that's going to grow. And like, you'd want that with the young quarterback that you have, and you would hope that would help bring him along. But at the same time, with how much that they have invested on the offensive line and how much they might have to continue to invest along the offensive line to retain those guys and the talent that they brought in, and including Tanner Bortolini and the way that he played this past season, filling in for Ryan Kelly, you're just kind of in this situation where, despite your heart telling you this is the guy that we want to keep and be our starting center until his career ends, you have to make a business decision at some point, and they're in a really good spot to move on.
Yeah, and per Spotrac, he's got an average an estimated market value of like $10 million, which that's pretty cheap for a guy that's done what Kelly has done. All right, that's absolutely cheap as hell, especially based off of his old contracts. But we're going to go ahead and dive right into this. This was the first question that Chris Ballard was asked. So go ahead and roll the clip, and we're going to listen, and then we will evaluate.
We're going to meet again next week. Ryan and I'll talk. I'm visiting with his agent again this week, and then we'll make a decision right after the season. The day we visited for a little bit, we didn't visit about his future, and then I was sick of the dog, and I said, "Hey, let's visit here." So we'll visit next week.
How was the audio on that? Could we hear that at all?
Oh yeah,
okay.
Oh yeah.
Gotcha.
This is a really quick clip. But like, the thing is, to me, it just doesn't sound like he's got a lot of gusto. Like he's we'll talk to his agent. We'll talk next week. And of course, Chris Ballard legitimately was sick. I made a joke that, he was trying to dodge the media,
Yeah.
and he lied about being sick. But it's an emotional choice. It sucks. You talk about a guy that's done so much for this team. He's played through injury. He's dealt with all the BS, which, let's be honest, Noah, there has been plenty of BS with this team over the past decade. Talk to me about what you thought about that comment. It just kind of seems like, yes, of course they're going to talk. Kelly's probably going to say, I'm worth this. Ballard probably already has an idea in his mind what Kelly is worth.
Yeah.
And it's probably on the lower end of things, given injuries and recent dips in performance. There's times where he's looked great. Last season, he multiple times was graded per PFF as the best center in football.
Yeah.
But now you're talking about 2024. And look, in the NFL, ladies and gentlemen, even with linemen, especially quarterbacks, but even with linemen, when you hit that decline, it starts to go steadily downhill.
Yeah. And this kind of sounded like a little bit of an answer that you would give when you're trying to respect a guy and not kind of move on from him too soon or seem eager to move on or whatever it is. I think, and honestly, I don't think they're entirely sure that they want to move on from him. There's still a lot in flux with that offensive line in terms of Will Fries and Braden Smith that we're going to get into later because he had some things to say about them and their situations as well. But if you end up not bringing back Braden Smith and you're not bringing back Will Fries, then maybe you don't want to replace 3 starters on your offensive line in one offseason and bringing back Kelly's something you want to do at that point. But in terms of the 3 of those, I have to imagine that Kelly would be priority number 3. And you kind of let those situations with Will Fries and Braden Smith play out before you move on to that decision that you have to make on Ryan Kelly, which is not going to be an easy one. I mean, yeah, we've underscored that. You could tell just by the somberness in his voice, kind of when we bring up Ryan Kelly, you could tell that's maybe there's respect there. And he doesn't want to have to make that decision, but he's obviously not going to commit to anything here, one way or the other.
Yeah, and at the end of the Jaguars game, Week 18, Ryan Kelly was walking off the field looking pretty sad. Honestly, he looked like he had swelled up eyes. He looked like he had really played that he believed anyway. If you're going with nonverbals, in communication class, he did not look very excited. Let's just say that. Looked like a guy that did not really know what his future held. And we'll have to see. But look, at the end of the day, regardless of what happens, what a pro, what a guy that's been through he's been through the ringer, right? With not even just the football, but also his real life, going through a lot of different adversity, ends up actually getting through that. Good for Ryan Kelly. But look, at the end of the day, this is a business before it's a sport. It's a business before it's a team and a roster. And you only have so much money you can spend. And at some point, the old dog's old, right? The old dogs have to go, and you've got a guy like Tanner Bortolini who had enough starting experience last year that he gave you some confidence. And, I think that you got to develop that. So, but the next guy we're going to get to, this is a huge one. And Patrick, I know that you're going to make some jokes about that comment. You are a menace in the chat right now. So I really respect Braden Smith. I think that you're talking about a guy that is a stalwart at right tackle. But the personal issues, the injuries, missing 12 games in the last 2 years, 7 this year, 5 last year. We're not talking about 12 in 1 year. We're talking about a nice even amount the last 2 seasons. And he's kind of dealt with injuries really his entire career. Like if you look at his career, he's missed a lot of games. And I think it's like 22, 23 or more games he's missed. And so before we jump into this, we're going to kind of like give a little synopsis before we jump into each clip. What are your thoughts on Braden Smith? I personally think he can still ball, but you're also talking about a guy who's going to save you an absolute boatload of money if you cut him.
Yeah, I think we had this conversation earlier on in the week where in your bold predictions, you were predicting a few cuts that were going to be made, and Braden Smith was somebody who was on that list. And I think maybe it was looking a little bit more likely at that point than it was after the press conference. Honestly, it still makes a ton of sense to move on if that's the decision that they end up making.
Sure.
and not so much in this answer that's coming up, but more so in like a later interview I think he did with the 1075, the Fan Morning Show, with Kevin Bowen and James Boyd. I think he used the word hopefully when he was talking about getting something done. Or hopefully in the terms that he'll be back next season, which is more of a commitment than he makes in this upcoming clip. Which maybe that's really what he feels, or maybe he's like in the Ryan Kelly situation. Maybe he's being respectful, and I don't think you're going to get too much in terms of how they intend to handle things on the business side. But from tone of voice, you can catch little hints here and there. So it's not going to tell you the whole story, but maybe it tells you what he's kind of how he's leaning.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and roll that clip on. It's about 20, 25 seconds, but it's about, man, yet again, another pillar of this offensive line. Uh-oh. There we go.
I think the world's been a great player for us. We'll see going forward. What I will tell you is he's doing really well, and he wants to play football. Okay, we'll work through the rest of it.
I mean, the thing is, we have to preface this. There's the national media interviews. This camera angle was brutal for hearing any freaking questions. I will tell you that. Whoever's videotaping that, just move closer if you can next year. But we're working through it. He wants to play football. That right there is a big one, because people have been like, what's wrong with Braden Smith? What the heck is wrong with Braden Smith? Well, guess what? He wants to play football. That's huge, because a personal matter could mean everything from an injury to something happening with your family. And both of those things are huge, because both of them could prohibit your future as a person. You know what I mean? So, it's one of those things where I think that there's confidence, and I truly believe that the Colts want Braden Smith to stay. He's not a free agent. Okay, yeah, you're going to save a bunch of money. I personally think $16.75 million is just almost too much to ignore unless you're talking about a superstar. Yeah. It's like all the injuries, all the uncertainty. But the thing is, if it's a personal matter, and Chris Ballard loves his guys, and I'm not saying that as a joke. I mean, this is a franchise that really values keeping guys together. Okay, do you really want to kick the poor man to the curb when he's going through a personal matter, and he's got all that skill? I don't know, Noah, what was your gut reaction from that? I personally felt like it was a guy who was saying, we want him to stay. We want to keep Braden Smith, but we're trying to work through things right now because they still haven't revealed, and they never will, what that personal matter is.
Yeah, and I kind of feel the opposite way of you a little bit, where I think this is a little bit more of maybe a pessimistic kind of look, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about some of these other guys, we're talking about people whose contracts are tolling at the beginning of March. They're rolling over and they're no longer a part of the team as of the league new year. That's not the case with Braden Smith. Braden Smith is under contract for all of 2025, and it'll be next March when that contract runs out. And he's talking about him like he's a pending free agent, is kind of how it feels. Where that decision of him coming back is up in the air. If you've got a guy who's dealing with a personal matter, no matter what it ends up being or what it is behind closed doors, and he's saying he's doing well and wants to play football, and the general manager still isn't making that declaration that he'll be back next year, then I think things are more up in the air than they would be for anybody else.
Yeah, and we'll actually get to a couple comments here in the chat. Do we have Braden Smith's replacement on the roster? You traded up to get Matt Gonsalves.
Yeah.
That's the guy. I really think that they weren't doing that for Bernard Ryman. Okay. They were doing that, I think, for Braden Smith, because I think that they aren't 100% sure on how healthy this guy's going to be. Again, he has missed so many games over his career, but he's missed 12 over the last 2 years. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to use my ADHD memory here, which is just, that's an oxymoron statement right there. But I think that he's missed 25 games in his career. And you can't you can't not look at that. You know what I mean? So I think that's why they said Matt Gonsalves has got all these intangibles. He's got all this athleticism. He can play left tackle. He can play right tackle, which, by the way, he played so many snaps on both ends of the offensive line. Completely different thinking, by the way. You're protecting the blind side. Sure, you're run blocking, but on the left, you're protecting that blind side, and that right side is the power side. You're doing a lot more of that pulling and hitting, and you're just sealing the edge. But at the end of the day, man, that's who it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be Matt Gonsalves. And then we have, if Gonsalves was a year older, I'd be comfortable with moving on. Yim, you're not wrong. I think that he played okay. I think he played as you would expect. There were times where you're like, oh my goodness, that's why we traded up for him. And then there's other times where you're like, he's a rookie and he's struggling. But the same was with Bortolini, So both of those guys, they had their struggles. But real quick before we move on to the next clip, what are your thoughts on Matt Gonsalves? Do you think that he could potentially, he showed plenty. He had plenty of opportunities to show what he can do in his rookie season. Do you think that he has the skills to potentially supplant Braden Smith, or are you like, oh no, he's got to be a swing tackle until Braden Smith becomes a free agent?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I think Yim kind of hit the nail on the head there with that comment, saying if he was a year older, maybe we'd be a little bit more comfortable moving on. Also, I guess that depends on what happens in the next year, right? The Colts don't really have the luxury where they have these big decisions they have to make on the offensive line, and they have two young guys who they've seen some things from and some good things and some up and down from both of them in terms of Bortolini and Gonsalves. But you're not entirely sure if you're ready to commit to him being the guy. I think if you're put in that situation where it makes sense to move on from Braden Smith, whether it be a personal matter or just business, or you're not sure he can be on the field for all 17 games next season, then you don't want to end up spending that 16 million or whatever, and you want to save 10 to 11, whatever the dead money minus is when you take that cap hit. Yeah, maybe that's a guy that you feel comfortable with fulling or slotting into that full-time role. You don't really have a ton of other options on the roster. And if you're moving on to save money at that tackle spot, I doubt you're doing it to sign another tackle in free agency. So kind of what you have on the roster is what you're going to end up working with. And you like to say that Gonsalves has done enough in his rookie season to earn the first crack at that. And I think he did. But at the same time, the whole main focus on this offseason from Chris Ballard has been adding competition, accountability, creating pressure and tension within the locker room, knowing that if players don't perform well, then they can be replaced. If you go into the offseason right now with only Blake Freeland to compete with Matt Gonsalves as that starting right tackle, I think you're letting him get pretty comfortable that he's got that starting right tackle role solidified. So if you do end up moving on from Braden Smith, yeah, I would say the Colts think they have his replacement on the roster right now. But still saying that you can't stand pat and move into the season with those three tackles in Ryman and Gonsalves and Freeland and not add any more to the group.
Yeah, and you know what? We need to get to the next Ballard question answer, if you will, and it is the man that Braden Smith and the man that Ryan Kelly protected last year, and that's Mr. Anthony Richardson. So many questions. So much is hinging on this young man's shoulders. Let's just go. I mean, it's a minute-long answer. Let's go ahead and fire away on this one. We got plenty to talk about with AR. I don't think we can hear it. Go ahead and rewind that bad boy and turn up that volume. Let's see if Ballard's got. There we go.
I'm guessing this is right.
No, it's the same. I mean, look, it's got to be the right guy to create real competition, but we want to create real competition. I think it's good for the team. I think it's good for Anthony. I don't like when we drafted Anthony Hyde knowing it was going to take some time. All right. And we knew there's going to be some hiccups along the way. And it's, I know we all want a finished product right now. I do. You do. Fans do. We all do. But I think as he continues to progress in his young career, us adding competition, I think will help up everybody's game. It's all on, yes, everything's on the table.
Yeah.
Oh, there's what. That's the key word there that I think everybody was holding out for. That's an open competition, which I think was a pretty strong statement for Chris Ballard to come out and say openly there.
Yeah, and look, another thing we have to reiterate this to people that are joining in now. Spooks Hill Joe with an absolute fire of a menacing comment in the chat. Look, we have to mention this first and foremost. This camera angle is going to drive people nuts just because you can't hear the questions. But what's most important is what Ballard is saying here. Anthony Richardson, I think that this is more of he needs to say that. He needs to say it's an open competition. Look, guys, they already committed to him being the starter. Okay, it's already done. It's already finished. But the key is you need to have something more than Joe Flacco, who was there sitting there. I mean, you got to remember, this guy was playing with the Browns, falling asleep on the sideline, baby. Like, this dude was falling asleep. I was not a fan of that signing. I'm still not a fan of that signing. And Joe Flacco, man, he was there to collect a paycheck and basically said, it's not my job, which it's not your job to develop a quarterback, right? But Gardner Minshew sure as hell embraced that role a lot more. And, when Anthony Richardson was getting advice, it was not from number 15. It was from number 4, Sam Ehlinger. So, this is critical. You need to bring in somebody who's at least going to try to take that job from him. I'm not saying that they need to be some jerk or some guy that's a bad locker room presence, but you need to bring in talent that is going to push this kid because he tapped out of a game last season. He said stuff like, I was tired. I ain't going to lie. Mm-hmm. Like, that's on the PR, dude. But like, you're looking at a guy who was multiple times around 33 to 40% completion. Like, there's so much that has to happen in this year with AR. And I just think that you've got to bring in talent that's going to push this dude. What are your thoughts? Do you think it needs to be a veteran? Do you think it needs to be a draft pick? There's a lot of ways to approach this.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to approach that. And I like that little add-on. I think that was Stephen Holder in the end, asking, are both things on the table in terms of free agency and the draft? And he pretty much said, yeah, anything's open, which is a good thing to hear, right? If you're looking at the free agency quarterback class and you're like, maybe there's 2 or 3 guys that could provide actual competition for Anthony Richardson, odds are you don't really grab one of those guys with the way that other teams around the league are needing quarterbacks and the money that they'll be willing to spend to get a starting guy that they think they're going to go into that next season as their starter. They're going to be willing to pay more than the Colts are for a backup, and that's just point blank. So you may be kind of left holding the short end of the stick at the end of the day when free agency comes to an end, and you're like, okay, we haven't added any competition at quarterback. We've made these promises. We know what we need to do to kind of further step up Anthony Richardson's game. That kind of forces you into a corner in the draft where you're waiting around. I mean, they're not going to go all out for the wrong guy at quarterback. I think we've been through enough Chris Ballard drafts to know that he's not going to pick a guy, and he says that every offseason. But if you get there and you're in round 2 and 3 and you see somebody there, maybe I think you might have to take him. I think I mentioned that on the bold predictions thing. If you've got no free agents to sign, you're only left with the draft. And if you get too far into the draft, then you're not going to find a guy who's going to actually compete with Anthony Richardson. Brock Purdy was drafted in the 7th round, but that happens once every 20 years. You get a Tom Brady and then you get a Brock Purdy. It's not going to happen for a while. You can't plan on that being your competition when you go into training camp. So you have to make a significant investment. Otherwise, you're just kind of admitting that you didn't find what you thought you were going to find when you've been sitting out here making all these promises.
Yeah, and before we get to the evaluation, hold the phone. We have the one and only Chad Jensen with
Big
a
boss.
top rope Randy Savage type of elbow here. Great show, fellas. See you tomorrow, Drake. Going to be going to the combine, waking up at the crisp hour of 4 a.m, baby, to get to the combine. Chad is the legend that actually is over the top of this entire thing. Without him, none of this happens. So, Chad, thank you so much from Noah and myself for your wonderful donation here. But look, you're not wrong. This is a free agent class that isn't exciting. Okay, like outside of your Sam Darnold and maybe your rah rah guy like Jameis Winston, who by the way,
Yeah.
what a great signing that that would be. You'd get everything you've ever needed in a leader and a guy that can really push AR while also helping him out. But this is that I love what you said there because like this is also not only is it not that great of a free agent class, but it's also not that great of a draft class
Yeah.
for quarterbacks. Once you get past Cam Ward and Shador Sanders, oh boy, does it fall off. And if you're waiting too long, you're going to get a guy that you're going to be like, there's no way in hell he's going to
Yeah.
even compete with Anthony Richardson.
Right.
Not saying that a guy like, Riley Leonard couldn't potentially with his style, but like there's been people that have been mentioning him. It's like, guys, no. Like Anthony Richardson is going to be the undisputed starter if you get a guy like Riley Leonard or Quinn Ewers or anybody like that. So it's one of those things where, you just have to get the right guy behind Anthony Richardson. You know what I mean, Noah?
Yeah, and he's reemphasized that. I mean, this is the main interview that we're going to be covering, but I mean, he did another 20 minutes with the morning show on 1075 The Fan. He did that 10 minutes with the local media, that offshoot that they did right after this press conference, and there was probably about 5 or 6 minutes there where he was talking about Anthony Richardson and talking about kind of how he's progressing through the offseason, but also about the kind of guy that they want to bring in to compete with him. And I think there was one question on the morning show that he was on where they were asking about how do you convince somebody that you're bringing in free agency that it's a legit open competition, because that some of the guys on the free agent market are gonna be hoping for a real chance to start. And if you come in and you don't have that pedigree and you don't have all the starting experience, if you're anything less than what Daniel Jones has been in his career, then I think if you come here, you're expecting to lose that. Like you're expecting to come into an open competition and have the disadvantage, which I think was a good point for them to bring up on the show to ask him. But he says, he didn't really have a straight answer for how to convince guys that it's an open competition. He said it just depends on the guy. So maybe that's another hint that free agency is not necessarily the biggest plan. He doesn't have to pitch a rookie that it's an open competition. They just come to the team that they're drafted to and they compete just by default.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, they need to do something. They need to push him. I see in the chat so many people are clamoring for Jameis Winston. We'll see. Okay, his quotes are some of the greatest quotes I've ever heard from a quarterback. Plus, he's parading down freaking. I think it was Bourbon Street. The guy's running down Bourbon Street yelling at fans. The guy's just an absolute card and an absolute legend. But we're going to get to probably the biggest free agent that they need to keep, that they need to consider, that they need to give a contract to, and that's Will Fries. Briefly, 5 games played last season.
Mm-hmm.
Ladies and gentlemen, at times he looked like a top 5 guard. In fact, PFF, I know that that's not the Bible of football, but it's a very good metric with 2 things, with defensive coverage and with offensive line play. Mm-hmm. And I'm telling you right now, Will Fries was destroying people. Okay, in those 5 games, he looked like a legit starter. And when in the hell have the Colts had consistency at right guard since they had Will Fries? And all he's done is just go 2022, 2023, and then 2024 was the apex. Goes down with the tibia injury. What are your thoughts on Will Fries? This is one where it's about a minute long, and you can tell there's a lot to take away from this clip on Will Fries.
Yeah, so he says a couple things differently that when you're comparing it to how he answered the questions about Braden Smith and Ryan Kelly. Let's just roll the clip and we'll kind of point out what those differences are.
Let's get into Will. From a 7th round pick to everybody, kind of beating him up a little bit as he kind of grew to coming into a really good football player has been really cool and fun to watch. Just the work he put in. I'll never forget after his first year, I didn't say this, but I sent him to a friend of mine in Chicago, and him and Danny Penner worked, and it was I think some confidence instilled in him, some strength, and then to watch him progress. And then unfortunate this year, with the injury, but the rehab has been, he's worked like anything you would expect from Will. Like never missed a day, doing everything in his power. He's progressing nicely. So I couldn't be more happy for him. Hopefully we can get something done. If not, we'll get into free agency and then we'll see what the market is. I'm visiting with his guys here later this week. We visited with Will a bunch.
Yeah, I mean, look, he sounded a lot more emphatic talking
Yeah.
about Will Fries than he did about Ryan Keller, Braden Smith. I'll tell you
Yeah.
that. Definitely seems like he wants to get it done. I'm looking at the PFF grades right now, and it's something to marvel. 86.9 overall, fourth out of 135 guards. Pass blocking grade, which, by the way, he was considered not able to do.
Yep.
74.9, 18th out of 135 guards. And then run blocking, which is his specialty, getting downhill and just bullying people, finishes his blocks 84.9, fifth overall. This is a guy you got to resign. I'm sorry. He's going to cost you about 14, 15 million a year.
Yeah.
You got to resign him. You know what I mean? You got to shore up the interior.
Yeah, and you could just tell by the length of the answer how excited he was to talk about Will Fries and his development.
Oh, yeah.
And you could tell like that little tidbit that he shouldn't have told us, where he sent him off to his guys with Danny Pinner in Chicago and had him work, and he came back and really progressed. You got to think that the Colts coaching staff, Chris Ballard, they're all proud of the guy that they drafted in the 7th round. They're proud that he ended up being a plus starter on the offensive line. And that's not something you give up. They don't want another team to reap the reward of what the Colts did in terms of drafting a 7th rounder and turning him into a plus starter. That doesn't happen, and they want to be the ones that reap the rewards from that. At the end of the day, though, it's all a money thing, and it's always been a money thing with Chris Ballard. I know the situation is how it is, and he said he's going to want to be more aggressive and push things over the finish line a little bit more. But I mean, it always seems like every year in free agency, an offensive guard gets paid a lot more than anybody expects. So the Colts are obviously going to want to try to get something done before free agency starts. Is kind of what it sounded like. He said he's meeting with Will Fry's representation next week, and I'm sure he's hoping on getting a deal done before that open negotiation period starts in the NFL, and Will Fry starts seeing what he could actually get on the open market. If Will Fry's agent is smart, he's going to hold off on Chris Ballard's negotiations as long as possible and kind of see what else is out there. Because the Colts aren't known to pay top dollar. Even if it is their guys, they're going to prioritize that. But you want to get some second opinions to see what you're going to get around the league and then bring those back to Chris Ballard, because Chris Ballard's offer is not going away. It can only go up.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm already seeing the timestamp here, guys. I'm just going to say this because it's a rare episode. If we go a little over an hour, so be it. You know, we're here to talk about football. But before we even get to it, I'm going to fire through these really quick. The third host of the show, the legend, Stats Matt, has made his opinion known. And it's a little bit of a past topic, but we'll run through these. Sorry I'm late, but the competition is not going to be a guy we really think is major competition in regards to AR. Daniel Jones is my guess. Look, that wouldn't be the worst thing. Okay, Daniel Jones wants to start again in football, and plus he played with a team that really didn't understand how to help him outside of having Saquon be his number one receiver. And then Curtis Rourke, look, you stop that, Stats Matt. I'm an Indiana fan. I'm an Indiana alum. No way. No way is Curtis Rourke going to push Anthony Richardson. Riley Leonard has a better chance of pushing AR than Curtis Rourke does. Curtis Rourke might not even go drafted. So we'll have to see about that. But yeah, man, at the end of the day, Will Fries, you had so many questions at right guard for so long. You finally got an answer. So we're going to go ahead and start jumping. We still got 4 more clips here, ladies and gentlemen, and the Colts news and rumors. So this next one has to do with Lou Anarumo. Chris Ballard actually gave a wonderful answer, and this is a microcosm of how he answers questions. He'll give you so much, and there's a lot of GMs that don't give you a damn thing. Okay, so go ahead and just play this. It's in regards to Lou Anarumo and what he thinks about players underneath the chameleon of a coordinator.
Look, I think Lou's very multiple, and I think he's proven that with what he's done. I think we do got some good young, fun players. It'd be good to get Samson. Samson's been doing a great work in terms of, rehab and coming back. So it'll be fun to watch how he uses Latu. If you're able to move Latu around and be creative with him. So that'll be fun to watch.
Yeah, it wasn't as long, but yeah, I mean, The thing that really jumped out to me is unprompted. He's mentioning Samson Ebukam, who everyone is kind of considering a super logical move to cut, right, and save that whatever 9 million or whatever it would be from cutting Samson Ebukam, especially after that Achilles injury, which makes sense. But in just a question about the defensive coordinator, if you just randomly bring up someone who didn't play a snap for you last year and how excited you are to see him in the new scheme, then it seems like that's somebody they're bringing back, and or not even bring it back, but not making that move on that everybody's expecting them to make. Yeah, and to mention in the same breath the rookie that you drafted in the first round, just kind of putting them on that same pedestal, which is interesting to see. That was the big takeaway I got from that. I know the Latu stuff's going to be more interesting. He's the more exciting player because he was the rookie last year, and you're always going to want to see someone be used creatively like that, where he's mentioning Lou Anarumo, maybe moving him around the front, getting him in different positions to really take advantage of his pass rush moves and get him on some different matchups instead of just straight up on the left tackle every play. So that's exciting, but yeah, that biggest takeaway was him throwing out Samson Ebukam's name unprompted.
Yeah, and look, I know it's not exciting, and I predicted that he could be a cut candidate, but like after hearing the way that, like you said, he just brought him up, it's similar to Lou Anarumo when they were doing his press conference when he first got hired. He just randomly brought up, I liked Latu out of the draft. He just out of nowhere, unprompted, just said that. And so you're talking about a guy that, hey, 2023, Samson Ebukam led the team in sacks. He was second in pressures, and he was an absolute menace in run defense. He did everything well. Okay, so if he can come back healthy, that's a guy that I think Lou Anarumo is going to use very well. Before we even get to the next one, though, I do want to ask, do you think that if Samson Ebukam returns fully healthy, that he's going to take snaps away from Leatu Latu?
I think that's what they wanted this past year, right?
That's
Was
fair.
for him to take some snaps away from him. So I think it'd be logical. I mean, he played a fair bit of snaps. Leatu Latu did. I think still you think of him better as a just a situational pass rusher that you're moving in on third downs, keeping everybody's legs fresh. I mean, maybe it's going to take some snaps away, but it's also going to take some snaps away from Kwity Paye and Dio if he's back. And pretty much anybody on the edge, you're just rotating these guys. You can never have too many defensive linemen, especially on a Chris Ballard team. He's always going to emphasize having 8 or 9 guys that can go at all times. We'll see. I think maybe Lou Anarumo's defense in the past has historically rotated those guys a little bit less than the Colts have in the past years, but you're still going to want fleets of these guys. So in terms of him taking snaps away from Latu, I wouldn't worry about that, especially in pass rush situations. I think Latu's going to get his fair share to make his impression.
Yeah, and just to kind of highlight a couple of these real quick. So, Stats Matt, something to remember with Lou is he's not confined to a Leo and a big end. The money from Ebukam would be nice, but he could also rotate with everyone instead of just one player. And then I'd like to see Ebukam back. And then I'm just going to mention this about Patrick Rye. Shamar Stewart literally had a 10.00 RAS.
Yeah.
All right, he put on an absolute show. And I mean, remember the last time that the Colts had a 10.00 RAS, it was Anthony Richardson. And before that, I believe it was Jelani Woods. Who knows what can happen at this point, because there's so many things that happened at the Combine. I haven't even had a chance to really watch today's. But we'll go ahead and dive right into the next one here. So the draft class, there's certain positions that aren't really that great. And then there's other positions where you're like, holy cow, there's so much that you could evaluate here, which is, again, why the Combine's mostly for interviews and to see what the character of a player is. But let's just go ahead and roll this clip, because this is one where Ballard, he kind of goes into a little bit of detail for about 30 seconds on the strength of the draft class. And we all know how much Ballard loves to evaluate the draft class as a former scout himself.
Yeah, it's not a very long clip, but you kind of like to see how his opinions stack up to what the general consensus around. This is really the only time we'll hear from him before the draft, so this is kind of our one chance to get the hints of kind of what he's thinking the strengths are.
I think every draft there's always players, but I think D-line is really good. I think tight end is really good. I think there's some the O-line. I would tell you, I don't like mid-round stuff is really deep. Those positions for sure. I think there's some good secondary players. So I think there's some positions that really do have some good depth in here.
Yeah, right there tells me that early rounds, Chris Ballard is thinking defensive secondary, defensive line, or tight end. That's what he's. That's what that tells me is the first round could be one of those three, maybe even the first 2 rounds. Dare I say the first 3 rounds? I mean, you got to think. Not long ago, this guy drafted Juju Brents, he drafted Darius Rush, and he drafted Jalen Jones, all in the same draft. And the only guy that has so far worked out is the 7th rounder, Jalen Jones. So Chris Ballard really isn't afraid to go multiple positions in the same draft over and over and over. And this is another season where the Colts need defensive interior. They need a tight end like nobody's business, and they need defensive secondary. So what are your thoughts about this? I think that this might be the most telling answer of any of these.
Yeah, I like that the first one that came up was defensive line. That's kind of what everybody's.
It's going to drive fans nuts if he does
they're
that.
all a little bit worried about that. You invested. You mentioned like double dipping at positions. He's done it in the past at defensive end with Quiddipe and Dio Adengbo, and that was pretty recent.
Back-to-back rounds too.
Yeah, first and second. So he's not when he finds a strength in a class, like he's not afraid to hit it often and early, which could drive fans crazy if he goes someone like Shamar Stewart that we talked about in round 1, and then comes back and gets an interior guy in the 2nd round. It's not crazy to think that he would do that just based on how much he values the defensive line. It's obviously going to have some dominoes fall in terms of free agency, because you can't keep everybody. He mentions that in a couple answers from now, also. But then you kind of get some hints where he's talking about in the mid-range offensive line's got some depth. I think we can expect an offensive lineman to be drafted somewhere in this draft. Usually he does anyway, but when he comes out right and says that he sees good depth in those middle rounds, you know that there's going to be a selection there. And then right at the end, just topping it off, saying there's good secondary players. I wonder if he was just thinking, oh, there's a couple of guys really early on that I would really like that I haven't forgotten about. Maybe the depth's not that great, but there are some secondary guys that I like. It's hard to tell where he's thinking about all these groups, but it's just interesting to hear him say some of those position groups and kind of how all those position groups that he mentions line up pretty directly with the needs on the team.
Yeah, and one of the things that really stands out, so Patrick Rice said, "Scare you good or bad," and then we'll get to Stats Matt's reply. But I took it different, Drake. He said the tight end is really good, so to me, he thinks it's a very deep class. And look, stats, it is a very deep class. You've got obviously Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland. You've got Gunnar Helm. All right, you have Arroyo. You've got a guy like Mason Taylor. Those are just a couple. It keeps going outside of even those, and you could pick up possibly a decent tight end on day 3. This is one of the deepest tight end classes I have seen in quite a while. And then there's right here. So scare me bad, Patrick. I don't know. Pierce has the feeling that he's been a big name since high school, but outside of pressure, he's underperformed in actual stacks. Stewart's kind of the same. And look, I hate to say this, but the Colts drafting Anthony Richardson, Juju Brents, Jelani Woods, A.D. Mitchell, so many athletic guys, they've either gotten hurt or they've just underperformed. And Pierce actually is one of the top defensive end prospects, and yet he's got character issues. Yeah. So it's there's a lot to. It's kind of like a minefield when you're trying to navigate. Who do we select? Look at all these athletic traits. Look at all this and that. Sometimes it's who's the guy that's the most passionate about football, who's the guy that's willing to bust his ass the hardest, and who's the guy that's willing to try the best and is the most technically sound. I think that's why they took Leatu Latu. I really do. I think that's why he was the first guy off the board as far as defense. But we'll have to see, because Chris Ballard, say what you want about him, and we've said it on here, he does go after those traits, but he's also pretty good talent evaluator and kind of knows what he's doing in that regard.
Yeah, I do think he leans heavily into those analytics with those numbers, like you've said. You kind of see that in the patterns. But man, it's very obvious also how much he values those intangibles, where he picks guys who are multiple-time team captains, guys who have gone through position changes and learned that way. Looking for that football IQ. Just young guys who've shown upside. He likes guys who transfers up in competition. Likes people who compete at the Senior Bowl and the scouting combine. I mean, he's measuring all these things when we're going out and looking at this combine group.
Yeah, and before, because we only have two more left here, and we've actually we've got a pretty good pace going here. So AL Val or Al Val, yes, but Tyler Warren is way better than all the other tight ends. Yeah. Like there's no doubt about that. You're talking about a guy who can block. He's going to block through the whistle. He's going to be able to navigate the middle of the field. I've seen clips where he goes right out to the slot, just dominates whoever the heck's in front of him. And I think it was Daniel Jeremiah that said he looks and feels like this lumbering guy who can't move until he starts moving.
Yeah.
And then it's like trying to tackle, a freight train. So look, if the Colts can secure Tyler Warren, I personally don't think he's going to be there at 14. I personally don't think that he's even going to get out of the top 10. Okay, I think that a team like the Jets is going to look at this guy and say, we have to have him for whoever the heck is the next quarterback. He is a weapon. Tyler Warren's a weapon. So, but we're going to get into this next one here. This one's arguably my favorite because Cam Skattebo is one of my favorite guys. I hope to God I can interview this guy tomorrow. We need to dive into what Chris Ballard says about the running backs because what he says is quite interesting.
Good question. Definitely a position that we need to make sure we have enough. And that's nothing against the guys we had last year. But I will say this, Zach Moss, who ends up in Cincinnati. Zach Moss was excellent for us. He was excellent. So we do have to get some more production.
Look at that, man. You're talking about a guy that at one point, when Jonathan Taylor was hurt, Zach Moss was a top 5 running back in the NFL. Everyone talks about that game where Gardner Minshew was filling in. They went over to Baltimore. They beat the freaking Ravens. It was because Zach Moss had 30 carries, dude. Like, this is a guy that was a complimentary piece against the Browns in 2023. At the time, the number 1 defense, 18 for Taylor, 18 for Zach Moss. They put up over 30 points on that football team. There is value to not having your bell cow tote that rock 25 times in the game, okay? Jonathan Taylor is currently in his prime, but if you want to extend that prime, you need to give the defense somebody else to worry about, okay? Because two things Taylor can't do. Can't pass block. He's basically a curtain, okay? He's a curtain, and then he's not a receiving back. He had like 17 catches last season. Okay, you need both of those things, and it's probably not going to come from Taylor. So I don't know about you, Noah, but this is a position that I know Taylor's your guy, and people don't like to necessarily talk about backups or complementary pieces. But man, when you have Anthony Richardson and you could potentially bring out Taylor on one side and another running back that can threaten a defense on the other, I mean that's kind of like you could have some hell to pay if you misread.
Yeah. You mentioned that the fans don't really like to hear about backups or complementary pieces, but in today's NFL, I would argue that a complementary or backup running back is pretty much a necessity, especially when you're this Colts roster has such a strength there at running back with Jonathan Taylor, despite that situation in the Broncos game where he drops the ball before the goal line. Some fans got on him. At the end of the year, you're looking back on it, you're like, this is the reason the Colts offense was explosive. It was the occasional deep shot to Alec Pierce, and it was Jonathan Taylor breaking long runs. That's what you have in terms of explosion on your offense. When you have a guy that level as your starting running back, and then no offense, obviously in this answer, Chris Ballard was trying to be very respectful to Tyler Goodson and to Trey Sermon here and not kind of downplay.
Kind of buried him, though.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I mean, I like that he led off with nothing against the guys that we have, but we need to add more, right? That talent drop-off was so drastic last year. And I think even more than just needing a complimentary guy, because you mentioned the weaknesses in Jonathan Taylor's game, right? He's not a pass protector. He's not a pass catcher. Even before getting a complimentary piece that can fill those roles, I think you need somebody who can be your backup Jonathan Taylor, right? When Jonathan Taylor can't take his 30 carries a game, or his 25 carries a game or whatever, or if Jonathan Taylor's dealing with some kind of nagging injury, which tends to happen if you have a bell cow running back, you need somebody who can step up and not have that huge drop off. If you're going out and you're just selecting somebody who you think you can be a difference in the passing game at running back, you're still going to have that hole to fill when you have Jonathan Taylor out, because you're not going to have that in between the tackles runner. So I think you need to consider more than one running back, or somebody who can really do it all and you can trust to be that guy who can run in between the tackles as well as be the complementary piece.
Yeah, and people fell in love with the Steelers game in 2023 when Taylor didn't play and you had Goodson running and you had Trey Sermon running. Look, Trey Sermon is slow in the hole. This dude he's just not a very fast guy, under 3 yards a carry. And Tyler Goodson is really elusive, but he's elusive when the line is blocking well. He's not a guy that's going to find a lot of his own space. And I'm just going to throw this up before we get to the last clip here. DSG Goodbar, legendary listener, legendary viewer, has been with this podcast for quite a while. Thank you so much for your contributions. I said a little while ago we need to draft a Scatterboo or Neal, then sign Gainwell, as he knows Steichen's offense. That would be a great rotation. Look, I am all for all of that. I'm all for either Scatterboo, I'm for Neal, or also bringing in Gainwell. You've got your receiving back in Gainwell, and then just give me Scatterboo. Just give me Scatterboo, please. The dude's an absolute truck who can still run the football. He can still catch the football. The Colts are probably, without question, drafting a running back. So we'll go ahead and get to this last one. It's arguably the biggest positional need for the team. It's a short answer, but it tells a lot about where this team is headed.
Well, we like the guys we have. We have work to do. All right. We think Oldtree's really come on. He did a really good job for us. We need to really find out what Mallory can be. He's had some flashes, but there's been some depth in there in terms of kind of similar guys like Granson, who was really good for us and was really good on teams. So getting active to game day is not always an easy thing, but it's one we got to do some work.
Yeah, that basically, in a nutshell. In a nutshell, that pretty much says, no Steichen here. We're going to bore people to death with his answers. Respect to Coach Steichen. He is not a good interview. This basically says we're not good enough at tight end. You had Ogletree, 9 catches. I think Mo had 12. I think Mallory had 4. That's 25. So my memory is serving me well because Granson led the team with 14 freaking catches.
Yeah.
Okay. For everyone wondering how bad that is, Juwan Johnson, the guy that I think the Colts should try to sign, had 50.
Mm-hmm.
With Spencer Rattler and Derek Carr as his quarterbacks. Okay. He outpaced the entire Colts tight end room by 11 catches on an offense that had not a lot of identity in 2 different quarterbacks, one of which is a veteran that might be falling off, and the other is a guy that who knows what Spencer Rattler is. People compare that guy to Patrick Mahomes. That's craziness. Like, I'm telling you, this is a position that if you don't nail it in this upcoming offseason, you are really doing Anthony Richardson a disservice. I know Jelani Woods was seen running on a treadmill. He's an athlete. Athletes run on treadmills, people, okay? Like, you can't bank on Jelani Woods anymore. I've got the guy's jersey in my closet, and I can't bank on Jelani Woods anymore. So it's one of those things where, what do you think about this position? What do you think Ballard's going to do in the draft? And do you think it's one where you might either double dip in the draft because it's so deep, or you might sign a guy and then draft a guy?
Yeah, it's hard to commit to double dipping just because there's so many positions that you need to fill on this team, especially on that defensive side of the ball with a new defensive coordinator. So I think you go into free agency expecting to sign somebody, and then if you end up finding talent available at your picks that you really want to take that chance on in the draft, then don't be afraid to double dip. But I still think you go into free agency next week with the intention of adding to that room. I think that Stats Matt brought this up perfectly in the comment where he was talking about these guys, where he didn't mention bringing Mo Alley-Cox back at all. Mo Alley-Cox's name didn't come up once, and you would kind of think that would be the guy. Ogletree and Mallory are the only ones that are under contract for this upcoming season. So he was bringing up those guys because he's been planning on having those guys back. No mention of Mo, and then that he was really struggling to find something good to say about Kylan Granson. Is what it sounded like. He said he did some good things for us, and then
On
he
teams.
scaled it back to he did something good on teams, and then he was like, it's hard to get on the active roster from teams, and then it was over. It was an interesting an interesting way to answer that question about Kylan Granson. So I'm not expecting them to chase after him when free agency comes around. But yeah, just the guys he mentioned, I wouldn't expect him to mention Jelani Woods. I think we've made that pretty clear on the podcast in these episodes. Like, show us in training camp. Until then, we've got nothing to talk about with you. But yeah, I mean, he just mentioned those guys that are on the roster, and if you're talking about Mo Alley Cox and Kylan Granson and the production that they had that you're replacing, you're not replacing that much, but Ogletree and Mallory had even less. So you're still dealing with a deep hole there. Yeah, just nothing really good to say about that tight end group.
Yeah, and if you really, before we get to the news and rumors, if you really want to talk about how bad the tight end room was, you could draft a guy day 2, day 3 maybe. Probably going to be the undisputed starter. I mean, you're talking about, Will Mallory, and you're talking about Kylan Granson. I mean, Kylan Granson had 14 catches and took a picture. Like Patrick mentions, the best thing he's done is he took a picture of him with a football like he was holding his newborn because he scored his first, and by the way,
his one touchdown.
His one touchdown from 2023. So there's so much that you have to do to this room. Outside of the Denver Broncos, it was the worst tight end room in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you've got to do something, and I really think you need to sign a guy and you need to draft a guy. And there's guys that you can sign that aren't Juwan Johnson, that aren't Tyler Conklin. By the way, Tyler Conklin, underrated. Okay, he had some pretty consistent production in New York. Yep. It's just one of those things where you've got to probably bring in a veteran, and then you need to draft a high end, prospect where you can have the veteran maybe mentor or at least help, because right now you're basically looking at Drew Ogletree as your blocker, Will Mallory as your pass catcher. He had 4 catches last year, so you can't rely on that. So, but now we're going to go ahead and after we got to all of that from Chris Ballard, we're going to hit these news and rumors. So the Colts, this one's interesting. They score 19th out of 32 NFL teams on the NFLPA report card. So in typical Colts fashion, they finish subpar, right? So this is where you talk about facilities, you talk about daycare, you talk about team travel, food, diet, workout facilities, all sorts of things. Do you really think that? I think these can be blown so far out of proportion. People are like, well, top 10. It's like, yeah, but there's even, the Bengals, for example, they've got an absolutely ridiculous type of setup to just get guys from the facility over to the practice field. They have to almost run across the highway. So, I think these can get blown out of proportion, but what's your take on this? I think that players are pretty honest on these, and they really do. They're not afraid to lay into some certain things.
Yeah. So 19th out of 32 does not sound good, but I think that's actually a pretty good thing for the Colts. To be honest, you're a small market team. In terms of liquid assets, your owner's not got a ton of money. He's rich, he's filthy billionaire rich, but in terms of other NFL owners, he's on the bottom end of that. So if you can keep your team in the middle of that pack, I think you're doing everything you can do to stay competitive and not having any disadvantages. Some of those numbers definitely are blown out of proportion. I was just clicking through a few of them. There's some of them that 48 out of 53 players agree that the equipment was good, which places them 30th out of 32 teams. I'm like, how does that make you bad? Everybody but 5 players on the team was happy with the training room, so that makes you almost dead last in the training room rankings. So yeah, there's some things you can tell. The only things you can really tell on this is it seems like Jim Irsay is respected in the locker room. It seems like Shane Steichen is respected in the locker room. The things that they scored low on were like travel and weight room and facilities and things like that, which I'm not going to be upset at the Colts for anything that they're doing there. They're spending the money. If the players are upset that they don't have as much access to first class seating as they want, and that's your biggest problem, then I think we're doing okay.
Yeah. And look, at the end of the day, man, like I said, there's certain areas of the NFL that just get absolutely blown the heck out of proportion. This is one of them. I'm serious. Unless you're bottom 5, It's not really something to worry about, but this one is something we have to get to real quick. The Colts visit players at the combine. So I'm just going to run down a list. So from the first one on, Ashton Genty.
Mhm.
Okay, that's the first one. Then we had, I believe, Ollie Gordon the second. Then they met with one of my favorite players they've met with is Barrett Carter from Clemson. That's a linebacker.
Mhm.
They've also met with Malachi Starks, and they've also met with Tyler Warren. Okay, so those are the prominent guys. What are your thoughts on that? They're addressing running back. They're talking to running backs. They're talking to linebackers.
Yeah.
They're talking to a safety. They're talking to a tight end.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty good spread, and with all these guys in Indianapolis, you expect them to talk to as many guys as they can. So you're not really reading a ton into these visits, especially when what I kind of think that these scouting departments are doing is they have this entire pool of guys when they start their process, right? And it's like 300, 350, 400 people on a board. Just like every media outlet will have, because every media outlet's scouting for every team. So you're going to PFF's big board; they're scouting for every team in the NFL. So it's going to be a 400 team board. NFL teams want that number to be way smaller than that, so they want to get down to maybe 150 before they head into the draft. So I bet some of these meetings that are going on are people that they're still trying to eliminate off their board. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're interested in drafting these players. Maybe they just need to know one thing, one way or the other, so they can cross them off or not. So, I mean, I'm sure some of these meetings that the Colts are having with players, at the end of these meetings, they're deciding to nix them off the board. So I wouldn't take that as, oh, Ashton Genty, they've got serious interest in him at 14. This is just a name to throw out. I don't know anything about that situation. And obviously 14 would be pretty rich for a running back. But I mean, if you're just going through these things, you're really only meeting with people you have questions on. If you've gone through the scouting process and through all the tape and everything, and you've scouted these guys with your area scouts, and you know their families and their personalities and everything, and you've done all that work, and you don't have any questions, you're not going to use one of your 18 formal meetings or whatever you have on one of these prospects. So these are going to be guys they're just looking for more information on to kind of narrow that board down.
Yeah, and you know what? At the end of the day, man, this is such a critical draft, critical combine, critical scouting time for the Colts. And I know that we're over an hour here, but we have to say this. Anthony Richardson's job's on the line.
Mhm.
Shane Steichen's job is on the line, but none more than Chris Ballard. He's been here almost a decade. You've made the playoffs twice. One time, you made it with Andrew Luck. Then the guy retires. The other time, you make it with old man Phillip Rivers, who then retired right after. And they begged him to stay, by the way. So this is huge. And I know that the RAS scores are going to possibly indicate, who are the Colts going to take. I think that you can look at it differently because of one player, and that's Josh Downs. They took a guy that isn't a Ballard type of receiver. They took a guy who Reggie Wayne and probably even Shane Steichen pounded the table for. And, well, Reggie Wayne mostly. And you're talking about skill and technicality over athleticism. So I'm hoping that the Colts go into this combine, this draft, this whole evaluation, the off season, a little bit different because there's a lot of seats that are hot. You know what I mean? So we'll have to see. But look, that's our show. We're getting long-winded here. If you liked what you saw, please go like the Horseshoe Huddle on Facebook. Follow Indianapolis Colts on SI.com. And subscribe to the Horseshoe Huddle on YouTube. Click that bell to turn on the notifications. I feel like I'm a broken record repeating all this stuff every single episode. If you want to listen to the Horseshoe Huddle podcast, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have a question or comment and you want to be featured on the show, you keep on throwing some comments in that chat, man. We are more than happy to get to you guys. But until then, we've got the NFL Combine still. I'm going to be at the Combine. Noah Gebert, he's going to be downtown. Look, if anybody, and I mean this, if any one of you guys are going to the Combine tomorrow, if you're staying late, please, for the love of God, come out downtown. We're probably going to be out, and we're probably going to see some of you people. But rest assured, Colts fans, Chris Ballard is taking this serious because his job is on the line. So we will be talking everything Combine next week, and we hope that all of you have an absolutely wonderful Thursday night, a wonderful Friday, a great weekend, and we'll be talking to you soon.